Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome back William Lynes. He's a urologist. His Kevin MD article is titled The Tragic Story of Mr. G, A Painful Journey Towards Understanding Suicide. William, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me.
So William's been on multiple times. To hear his story and background, just go to kevinmd.com/podcast. Upper right-hand corner, there's a search bar. Search for William's name to hear his prior episodes. So today, let's talk about your article. Go straight into it. Tell me about the story.
Well, I had a very memorable message left for me one morning when I came into my office, my urology clinic. It was a message taken by my nurse sitting on my desk, and it was a phone message from the wife of a patient of mine. We'll call him Mr. G. And it was a single sentence question in which she asked, "Doctor, why did my husband commit suicide last night?" Well, needless to say, I was startled, and I reflected quickly on Mr. G. I had been treating him urologically for the last few months prior to this, and it had only recently come to my attention that his condition was recurrent flank pain from renal colic. He was passing intermittently kidney stones. So I was anticipating a very uncomfortable phone call, and I went on and I reviewed the chart and tried to have as much information as possible. Mr. G, it turns out, was in his 60s. He spoke with an Italian accent. He had a great difficulty expressing himself, which I always thought went beyond the language barrier. He understood my words. I understood his words. It wasn't a language problem. It was something else. He seemed to be burdened by obsessions. He talked in circles. He asked the same questions over and over again. And he gave such a disjointed history that really it took me several months to figure out first that he was complaining of intermittent pain, and then, as it turned out, that it was from kidney stones. When I finally realized what his problem was, I was relieved, actually, because while there would be possibly future episodes of pain, I felt very comfortable with a fairly common condition, and I thought that I could treat him well. However, the fact that he committed suicide and he ended up shooting himself suggested to me that while I felt comfortable with his diagnosis and treatment, Mr. G did not. In general, about suicide, I firmly believe that people who commit suicide are suffering from unendurable pain. It's generally emotional pain. In this case, it seemed to be physical pain, but it's generally emotional pain. And the emotional pain is really similar to renal colic. I mean, it's very, very severe that brings them to that point. They have a feeling of unendurable suffering with no solutions, foreseeing a future plagued by this intolerable pain, and they commit suicide. I failed to grasp the emotional anguish that the condition that Mr. G had inflicted on him. He must have had tremendous emotional insecurity stemming from it's sort of an unpredictable disease process of periodically passing stones. And I think that I, in retrospect, failed to communicate the treatability, the commonality of the condition to him. This insecurity, emotional anguish, is a common backdrop to suicide. My own life at the time was different than it is now. I hadn't reached the point of my own emotional anguish and desperation, hopelessness that caused me to eventually attempt suicide multiple times. I like to think that had I seen Mr. G now, that I would have been able to comfort him and help him better.
Tell us what your interactions were like with Mr. G. What was it like in the exam room when you saw him?
It was confusing. I was a specialist as a urologist, and so I would get consults And the person who referred him to me suspected that he had a urologic problem, but it actually took me several months to figure out, though, oh, it's recurrent pain that he is having. So he gave a disjointed history, as I said, and talked sort of in circles. And I remember being really frustrated in dealing with him. And then naively, I was relieved when I figured out that, oh, he has renal colic.
And how long had you been treating him?
I believe for about 2 months.
So you walked into the office one day and you received this startling message
Yes,
from the nurse.
yes.
Tell me your initial reaction and what did you do next?
It was one of I was startled. Uh, I sort of think the nurse should have talked to me before I walked in my office, but that's I guess another subject. But it was, oh my gosh, what is this woman talking about? And so it was one of being startled.
And did you eventually have a conversation with Mrs. G?
I did. I called her, like I said, I reviewed his history and so forth, tried to prepare myself as much as possible. But I talked to her, and as I recall from the conversation, first of all, she was angry, not really at me, but at him for committing suicide. And I think that's a very common reaction of family members in situations like this. She seemed to confirm the fact that that the primary reason for his suicide was not understanding the unpredictable nature of his condition. She really didn't have a lot of specifics about what was wrong with him, but she knew that his clinical condition was responsible for his actions.
Now, how did this episode change you as a physician? What did you do differently in the exam room as a result of this episode?
I'm not sure I did a lot at that time. This was in the late 90s. I very soon would be in the middle of my own mental health breakdown. What happened to me is I had a couple of medical catastrophes occur. When I went back to work, I had severe problems with depression and anxiety, and I marched down this downward, I call it downward spiral, into a suicidal behavior. So very soon after Mr. G, I was having great difficulty practicing. And, eventually after my last suicide attempt, I decided that in order to save my life, I would have to retire. And I'm retired. I didn't mention that, but I'm retired now.
Now, as you reflect on this tragic story, is there anything that you wish you would have done differently?
I wish I would have had a little bit more sensitivity for the man. I really am haunted by him. Knowing what I know now about suicide, mental illness, I've always thought that I could have helped him with his insecurities about the urologic problem that he was having.
So what
But
specific things regarding suicide that you know now that you wish you knew back then?
that it's not an answer, that it tears up your family. There's always a possibility that you're going to fail an attempt. I didn't mention, but he shot himself. So those are sort of the things that I would have talked about. I'm a Christian, and I really believe that the answer for suicidal people is found in the Bible and with Christ. And I wasn't really witnessing to people at that time, but I would have brought that into the exam room, and hopefully I would have made a difference.
Now, for the clinicians listening to this story on this podcast, tell them what kind of signs should they be looking out for? What kind of questions should they be asking to prevent occurrence like this for other clinicians?
Well, of course, being a urologist, it's a little different than for a primary care physician or certainly a psychiatrist. But I mean, there are signs of suicidal behavior ideation, which we talked about just recently about the four steps in suicidal ideation, but things, the life becomes disrupted. Sleep is a problem, not making deadlines, having difficulty going to work. These are all signs of the deep despair and mental illness, which may end in suicidal behavior.
You mentioned that for those who contemplate suicide, scripture may be an answer. Talk more about that.
One scripture is James 1:12, and Jesus said that blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life. I believe that you can be saved through belief in Jesus Christ, and it sort of puts life's tribulations and problems in perspective when you know what your e eternal resting place and life will be like.
We're talking to William Lynes. He's a urologist. He's telling his story on his Kevin MD article, The Tragic Story of Mr. G, A Painful Journey Towards Understanding Suicide. William, if today you were still practicing and you met someone like Mr. G, same clinical scenario, how would you approach him?
I think I'd be more understanding. I think I would spend more time with him. I think that I would appreciate the insecurity that he felt. I've dealt with a lot of kidney stone patients in the past. I've been retired for a long time, but it's not a new diagnosis. And it's periodic episodes of severe unrelenting pain. It can happen while you're driving home from work. It can happen while you're sleeping in the middle of the night. It totally can destroy your life by the unpredictable nature of it. As a urologist, I mean, I looked at it surgically in terms of, well, yeah, we can do a uroscopy, we can do lithotripsy, but Mr. G, in retrospect, really brought home different clinical psychological manifestations of this disease process, which I appreciate much more now.
And my final question, William, tell us some of your take home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
People who commit suicide have unendurable pain, generally emotional, but it's pain, all the, as bad as renal colic is. It is associated with emotional anguish and then a decision to end your life. Mr. G taught me some humility and a type of understanding of the disease process of renal colic that I never really appreciated before.
William, thank you again for coming back on the show, sharing your story, time, and insight.
Kevin, thank you very much. Thank you for all you do, and definitely thank you for inviting me.